Dear students, today we are going to study Plato. Plato is known to the world as the most celebrated disciple of Socrates and a renowned political thinker in Greece. It is believed that he was born in 427 BC, but he certainly died in 348 BC. During his time, the glory of Athenian art and literature was on the wane, and philosophy and oratory were dominant. Many philosophers focused on the quest of truth and applying test of reason for a variety of matters. It was an age of critical inquiry and analysis rather than creativity as such. Plato was not a professed critic of literature. He looked at literature and art through his political specs. His critical observations are not available in a single treatise. He has written many treatises like Ion, Phaedrus, Republic, Dialogues, etc. However, when we look about his views about literature, it can be known as theory of ideas or theory of mimesis as such. It is also known as theory of imitation, and his views on theory of ideas or theory of mimesis are generally known as his views of art as such. Being a philosopher, Plato focused on truth in art and poetry rather than aesthetic beauty. Plato's views on poetry are found in his book, Republic. In this book, Plato has discussed in detail about constructing an ideal state and the ideal man of the state. Being this aim, Plato has focused on art and literature so that they can be beneficial to molding the character of the citizen for the ideal state. Plato believed that poetry is an art of painting, sculpture, and others. Plato's thoughts on art and literature are basically known as his theory of ideas or theory of mimesis. In chapter 10 of his Republic, Plato affirms that ideas are the ultimate reality. Things are conceived as ideas before they take practical shape as objects. The idea of everything is its original pattern, and things or object itself is its copy. Plato considered art and literature as thrice removed from reality. He has explained his theory by taking the example of a bed. Every object he focused that exists in three different ways. For a bed, there is 1. The idea of the bed that always exists in the mind of the god. Ideal form of the bed, that is what we can call it as such. A particular bed by a carpenter, it is a material bed or an object called bed, and that is the second part. And number 3, an imitation of a bed produced by an artist in the form of a painting of a bed is, we can say, as an art or imitation of a bed. So, after completing this point, we will think about how Plato had given his theory in detail. Plato believed that God is the real maker or original creator of the bed. The carpenter, who actually makes bed in an object form or materialistic form, is an imitator of God's original idea. So, the carpenter's bed is mere a copy or an imitation, or that is an imperfect representation or mimesis of God's original idea. That is what he thought. And the third, the painting of a bed by a painter is an imitation or a copying of carpenter's bed, which is a copy or an imitation of original idea. Hence, a painter's painting of a bed is an imitation of an imitation. It is thrice removed from reality. Besides, a painter can make a painting of a bed only from a specific angle. If the angle changes, the appearance of a bed obviously changes. Thus, a painter cannot make a truthful picture of a bed like painter's painting. That is what we can think about. And all artists and their arts are thrice removed from reality as such. Plato thought that art, poetry, painting, sculpture reproduce things with the help of words, colors, and stone, respectively. It merely copies a copy. Things or objects are imperfect copies of the ideas. Their reproduction in art is more imperfect as they are away from reality or original form. Thus, all arts and their artists take men away from reality. Plato commented that production of art or poetry neither help to mold the character of the citizen nor to promote the well-being of the state, the two things by which Plato judged all human endeavors as such. Plato, in his book, also attacked on poetry as such. Plato has commented that poetry or literature as an imitation or an imperfect representation of the original or the ultimate reality. It is thrice removed from reality, and further Plato attacks poetry like poetic inspiration as such. Plato in his Ion thought that poet writes because he is inspired. Deep reasonable thinking is not at the root of the writing of poetry. The muse or goddess of poetry suddenly fills in him and makes him sing. He thought that such outpouring of the soul cannot be a reliable substitute for truths based on reason. Poetic utterances contain profound truth, but we have to apply test of reason to comprehend them fully. By themselves, they are not safe guides. Poetry cannot take place of philosophy as it is, product of the impulse as such, product of the moment rather than cool deliberation as such. Philosophy helps to make the individual a better citizen and the state a better organization. In Republic, Plato advocated that poetry, that is hymns to the gods or panegyric songs on famous men, should be allowed in the ideal state, as they can mold the character of the citizens and always it can help them to be morally perfect. Plato's second attack on poetry is the emotional appeal of poetry as such. Plato charged poetry as it appeals to our emotions. Being a product of inspiration, it affects the emotions rather than the reason, the heart rather than the intellect. It adds beauty to the original inspiration. Poetry imitates or represents life. Poetry through imaginative characters, scenes, and situations appeal to our emotions and keep the reason suspended. Emotions like the poetic inspiration, momentary in its impulse. It cannot be safe guides to us like reason. Plato illustrates it with the help of tragic poetry, where the tragic scenes of weeping and wailing are shown to move the hearts of the spectators. In Republic, he mentions that it has a baneful effects on our mind. He says, for if we let our sense of pity grow strong to see the grief of others, it is not easy to restrain it or to control it in the case of our own sufferings. To simplify it, let us take an example of Marathi film Sairat. In the film, two college friends, namely Archie and Parsha, belonging to upper and lower caste respectively, fall in love and face the issues of social honor due to stringent caste system. However, they elope and manage to get married. They were happy in their Sukhi Sansar, happy married life. But at the end of the film, Prince, who is Archie's brother, with his fellow men, manages to find them and kills them brutally, leaving their one-year kid orphan. We feel pity for Archie and Parsha and their orphaned child. The last scene gives a shock. Plato thought, if we feel pity to see the grief of others, what will happen or how can we bear if such type of grief appears in our own life or in the life of the people who are very closely associated with us? Thus, poetry fed and watered the passions instead of drying them up. Plato believes that for the happiness and virtue of mankind, it is necessary to rule over the emotions. Non-moral character of poetry is again a point where Plato has attacked poetry. Plato indicts poetry as it lacks morality as such. It treats both virtue and vice in life in the same way without any moral considerations. Plato was not happy to see the virtuous characters coming to the grief in the literature esteemed in his day. The epics of Homer or the verse of Hesiod or the odes of Pindar, and the tragedies of Achilles, Sophocles, or Euripides are some of the examples where such type of things have been shown. In Republic, he mentions that poetry had shown many evil livers happy and many righteous men unhappy. It, of course, disturbed Plato. The portraits of gods and heroes in literature are also objectionable in the literature during Plato's time. Gods are shown as unjust, revengeful, or possessing vices. Heroes have uncontrollable passions of anger, pride, grief, etc. Hence, Plato thought that literature or poetry corrupted both the citizen and the state. In the next, appeal to baser instincts is another attack on poetry made by Plato. He says, drama, unlike poetry, aims at stage performance. It is the heterogeneous audience who decide the success of drama. In order to satisfy them all, a dramatist makes use of quarrels and lamentations in tragedy and imitation of laughable things in comedy. All those things, according to Plato, appeal or arouse the baser instincts in the human mind. Such plays, Plato thought, provide bad taste and moral looseness in life. However, Plato goes further and he attacks poetry or especially drama in the point effects of impersonation. Plato thought that sometimes playing certain evil roles in drama can have unfavorable effects on the actors. Impersonation of the characters like villains or criminals or cowards or slaves may have adverse effect on the actors, even make the actor weak in his or her personal life. Plato views that a role playing of men of brevity, wisdom, virtue, and the noble men can have favorable or let us say beneficial effect on the actors. These noble qualities may enter in the personality of the actors. Dramas which reflect brevity, nobility are encouraged in the ideal state, but dramas which can have adverse effect on the mind of the actors, however, Plato doesn't allow such type of drama in the ideal state. Next, he comments on the poetry or especially drama, saying as tragic and comic pleasure provided by the plays. About the pleasure provided by tragedy and comedy, Plato questions, what is it in a painful scene that causes pleasure? Psychologists get confused to see such things. They maintain that human nature is a mixture of diverse feelings like anger, kindness, envy, grief, etc. Singly, they are troublesome, but when these feelings are excessed, then it offers pleasure. It pleases man to lose his temper or to go on weeping. In comedy, incongruity between what a character is and what a character does provide pleasure. For instance, in comedy, a coward is shown as brave, a fool is shown as a wise man, a cheat as an honest man, etc. Such a pleasure, Plato thought, is malicious. The characters, the actors become the object of pity. It is fundamental that comic can be created or offered only if the character is lovable. Plato criticizes much involvement in laughter as it affects seriousness of conduct necessary to do great deeds. To conclude, Plato has also focused on the point of the function of poetry. Though Plato thought, though poetry provides pleasure, mere pleasure cannot be its function as such. Plato cannot think of separating poetry from morals. Truth is the test of poetry, that is what Plato thought. It should add something to the knowledge of virtue, so it can mold the character and promote the welfare of the state. A poet is a good artist only if he is able to provide some moral values. For Plato, pleasure, though of the highest kind, ranks low to that of values. Plato asserts that poetic truth should be the highest truth as such. Ideal forms of justice, goodness, of beauty should be reflected in the poetry as such. To conclude, we will think about what are Plato's observations on style. Plato lived in an age of oratory. He believes that principles
which are applicable for the spoken word and a speaker are equally applicable to the written word or a writer. In Phaedrus, he has talked about the whole range of practical style. The first rule for a good speech, according to Plato, is a thorough knowledge of the subject one is to speak on. A speaker must be sure of what he has to say. A speech must impress the hearers as a written work has to impress the readers. So, the second rule for a good speech is to know the art of speaking. It can be a natural gift, and through the practice and the knowledge of rules, one can be a good orator. Third rule in his book he has given is his thought upon the subject must follow each other in a natural process, in a natural sequence. The first thing come first, the middle ones in the middle, and the last in the last ones. It will form an organic whole. Last rule Plato thought for a good speaker is he must have knowledge of human psychology so that he can appeal to their hearts. Hearers are also human beings with their likes, dislikes, choices, and ideologies. A speaker should know it beforehand. To be a successful writer, one can also follow the same rules as such. When we think about what is Plato's contribution in the field of criticism, we can say that Plato criticized poetry and drama. His views on art and literature are noteworthy. Through charges, he talks about the nature, method, and the function of poetry. His views on truth in poetry are insignificant. His observations on the source of tragic and comic pleasure are substantial. His views on the style of speaking are also much significant. He is the first critic who says all art are imitation or mimesis, which imitate the object of life and nature. Thus, Plato's contribution to the theory of criticism are considerable. So, today we will stop here. Thank you very much.